Good morning and welcome back to our Ask the Agronomist video series. I'm Kyla Watson here with Phil Long. Phil, how are you doing on this sunny day?
I think you nailed it on the head there. I'm doing great. It's nice and sunny and going to be very hot this week.
Yes, it is going to be very hot. Who would have known? Last week cooled off just a little bit, but summer's still here.
Yeah, summer's not over yet, that's for sure, and it's probably some of the most heat we've had all summer.
Right, yeah, very true, very true. Well, today we're going to be talking about corn and basically its reaction to this type of weather. And are we in for an early harvest?
Sure, yeah, exactly. I mean, this is the perfect time to talk about it. We're kind of getting into the final phase in terms of corn's yield factors. So we're looking at kernel weight today, so the last part of it, test weight and so forth, all those things. But the amount of dry conditions, droughty areas that we've had, as well as the storm that rolled through Iowa here in the last 2 weeks now. A lot of these issues popping up as we get close to harvest, and we planted early in a lot of cases, and just have the setup right now for possibly an early corn harvest.
Mm-hmm. Would you say we're ahead of schedule as far as the GDUs on average?
Yeah, that's a great point. We are. If you look at least across the state of Iowa, and I know Minnesota and elsewhere, we're sitting well ahead of GDUs on average. So in some cases 100 to 200 GDUs above right now. So we're pushing on ahead, but we got to remember the other things we always talk about. For good grain fill period, ideally we've had pretty good situation, but we just haven't had the moisture in a lot of cases. So we've had cooler nights, really cooler than normal. We've had nice, warm, sunny days, and right this week's going to be exceptionally hot, so the corn plants are going to kind of shut down to try and conserve moisture. But really we've had an ideal situation. We just haven't had the moisture in a lot of cases, so we're seeing corn start to mature. We're seeing corn start to drop ears, unfortunately, or droop down and start to die from the top back. So just a lot of things pointing to corn's trying to finish up here, and we're not getting a whole lot more moisture, so kind of finishing up and getting pushed a little faster than typical.
And I know you have 3 examples with you today. Let's just start with the one where it's dying from the top.
Yeah, so I've got a couple examples here. So this one, dying from the top down, would be our best example. Obviously I'm standing behind in front of a cornfield that looks slightly better, but this one came from another field. On down the way you can see some drought issues. So if you look at the top of the plant, you can see this one's starting to yellow and starting to brown up. Typically that's what happens. They may show some firing from the bottom of the plant, but then also they'll start to show yellowing and dying of the upper leaves. So this can be, sometimes certain hybrids do this more than others, but this is typical in a year like we're seeing. So we're seeing dry conditions, stress after pollination, obviously. All of these things lead to the plant, as it utilizes it. We've seen this a lot more in the last several decades, that corn starts to die or senesce from the top down. So not necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have anthracnose or European corn borer or another problem out there. We see this kind of throughout the stressed areas. So it's really what it's doing is it's moving those nutrients into the ear and kind of from both ends. So it's doing the best it can. These modern hybrids do a really good job at moving those nutrients to the ear. So this one is starting to fire at the top and head down the plant. So we know that it's also showing a dropped ear. As I picked this one, it was dropped in the field, hanging down. So obviously it's starting to dry up and trying to finish out as well.
Okay, and then what about the one where it's starting to fire from the bottom?
Yeah, so I pulled a pretty good example here. This is a lot of situations in our state and elsewhere. We're seeing very dry conditions. This would be a good example of that. This one is actually, if you looked at it right now, you'd probably think, if you saw a whole field of this, that we're almost ready for harvest. This is obviously a smaller ear. It was on a sandier spot, so it's a little bit shrunk back, had some kernel abortion, and obviously probably lost a little test weight as we just couldn't finish very strong, didn't have the moisture to complete it. So there's not really a green leaf left on this, and this was on a sandhill. The only good thing is you can look, and this is another thing I want to point out as we go through this and you're scouting your fields for harvest. this green stalk at the bottom is very important as we're doing pinch tests and push tests. It has a strong stalk on it still. It may have senesced a little early, but we still have a strong stalk holding it up, so that's a good thing.
Okay, very good. And then that last example that you have is a red stalk.
Yeah, this one's kind of one of the different ones, but we get a lot of questions on this, it seems like every year. So you can start to see this one has green left in it, but you see streaks of purple. You see streaks of purple on the leaves, streaks of purple on the stem. And if I pick it up here, you can see all the way at the bottom by the nodal roots here I cut off, you see purple all the way along. So this is a question that gets asked a lot. So what's going on here? Early in the season, we'd say obviously it could be potentially a phosphorus stress with the purpling and leaves. At this point, it's just too much anthocyanin building up in the stem and the leaves. So why is that? Well, if you look here, this field actually had quite a bit of deer damage. So this one actually, I would say, could be in some cases characteristic of what some of the farmers that had damage during the derecho might encounter. So this one got broke off. You can see the point of attachment on the ear shank there got broke off. It looks like a couple weeks ago. And you can see that as you look at the ear that it's extremely light and chaffy. It looks like sweet corn after that. Dries down, really doesn't have any test weight. Doesn't really have much starch accumulation either. So this would obviously not be very good kernels to have to harvest. It would potentially, you'd have issues just going through the combine, grinding them up. They're soft and they're not filled out. So this would be a huge challenge to have harvesting. But just a reminder, if you're seeing purpling and stalks and so forth, look at it. Typically, you'll see a barren plant. No ear on it, or maybe a small, exceptionally small ear or something like that. But in this case, it was busted off. The shank and that point of attachment was broken. So, like I said, those that went through the Iowa derecho and other areas that got hit, the areas that got things snapped off or different situations in the field may be encountering some of this huge challenging harvest issues, and this is one of them. So just pay attention to those red plants out in the field.
And that actually leads me right into my next question, was what are the impacts of this going to be?
Sure. So I mentioned before, we're really starting right into kernel weight, kernel fill, that last part. Our 5 typically dent is going to go from, it's about a 35-day window, but as we have this much heat and we're ahead on GDUs, that kernel fill period might get scrunched a little bit, might shorten up with the stress that we're encountering. So unless, and I'm going to make the exception right now, unless you put a fungicide on, those fields typically are staying greener. The ones I'm noticing around us right now, obviously that's going to extend that kernel fill period, but it's right now it seems to be shortening up in most cases, so we're reducing that kernel fill period. So the start of R5, which we're past the early dent stages. Most cases I've heard silage harvest starting in some areas, so we're halfway through, 50% milk line roughly in some areas, not quite that far in others, but we typically have about 45% accumulation of actual dry matter in the kernel at the start of R5. So that's about 40% of your yield left on the table. So say we're halfway through that, roughly 20% still yield left on the table. But a lot of these areas have been seeing drought stress earlier, even pollination and onward. So just a lot of really tough situations out there, and I know corn as it starts to mature and so forth a little early, what I'm seeing in a lot of areas is really uneven. The ears being drooped down right now, they're not throughout the whole field, so that tells me there's going to be a lot of variability in those fields, a lot of variability in moisture and so forth. So a challenge for those ahead coming into harvest. But one thing I want to say is really important right now as you're getting out, looking at fields, getting ready for harvest, and a lot of farmers getting equipment ready. Also get out in your fields and make sure that you go out and do what we call the push test or the pinch test on the lower stalk. I'm standing by the edge of the field here. These stalks are pretty strong, but just an example, just to push it 10 to 30 degrees or more and see if that lower stalk has good health. It's got that green color in it, and is going to stay standing. Otherwise, you can pinch the lower part of the stalk with your fingers, see if it has any issues, maybe some stalk rot coming on early, things like that. But go into the field and do some of that so you can kind of prioritize, because this fall especially, for a lot of areas, especially the drought and storm hit areas, is going to be really important to prioritize so we don't have down corn or potentially dropped ears and things like that as we really stress the corn towards the end of grain fill.
Okay, very good. Is there anything else that you would like to add this morning?
No, I think the importance right now of scouting can't be understated. Obviously, we want to get out there and scout. Those that had a fungicide, they're going to be sitting pretty good, but I would mention those that know they have more of a racehorse hybrid in the field. Those are ones you want to keep an eye on. Go out there, do the stock test and so forth, because and especially if you have fertility issues in your field, that can really exacerbate this issue. It's gonna end up, those hybrids are gonna end up pulling from the stalk, the lower stalk, and if they don't have a fungicide, didn't have enough fertility, or just didn't have the water to get the fertility in the plant, that's gonna compromise that lower stalk. So just today, I think the biggest key right now as the corn is starting to mature is make sure you get out there and look at your fields and see which ones need prioritized to the top of the harvest list.
All right, very good. Well, thank you for joining us this morning, Phil. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. Have a good day.